Thank you, Dr. Jacinthe. So let's look at the question queue and see if there are any questions first. Otherwise, I have a couple for you. According to, I'm very impressed, by the way, on how the Lallemand team is approaching this. I think one of my biggest comments is I really believe that your team has to approach the keto trend really head on with this solution, because I've seen a lot of the keto breads who have struggled with their formulation on total sugars, and the baking performance suffers there. Okay, so this particular solution would be so awesome for the keto trend, and that particular trend is just shooting up in the United States. Two questions. How did you measure oven spring and volume?
The oven spring is, Luke, what's the name of that equipment? But the bread volume we do it.
Well, we call it oven spring or oven jump. You know, we do measure the height of the dough before we put the dough in the oven. So we measure proof height. And then we put the bread, the dough in the oven, we bake it, we measure baked height.
Okay.
And we subtract the baked height with the proof height, and we get the oven jump. So we know how much expansion.
We're talking about 27 centimeters then. Is that right?
That could be. I didn't notice exactly.
Okay, it was 27. So I was like, how did you get the number? Anyway, minute question. And the oven spring, the volume, did you measure it through the rapeseed or through a volumeter?
We use the Volscan volumeter.
Okay.
So
that's
it's
pretty
a
good.
laser beam. So
yeah, that's pretty good for that.
Yeah.
For the sugar replacement solution. That's very close. So really good to see that. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'll answer the question. The FSA 2013 is composed or contains a starch modifying enzyme. As you know, flour contains a lot of starch, and that starch usually could be providing some monosaccharides that the yeast can use to ferment. But using once these sugar are used, there's no more monosaccharides available, and to form also the Maillard reaction with the protein. So we use modifying enzymes to modify the starch and produce or kind of generate monosaccharides and disaccharides in the dough. So there's a sweetening effect coming from the degradation, if you wish, of the starch.
So to add to that, Luke, did you add any kind of sweeteners in there?
No. Well, in some cases, there was no added sugar at all.
I know, but did you add like a stevia or a...
No, by the way, I was listening to Jacinthe, and I was thinking to myself, you know, aspartame would not survive baking, so it cannot be used as a sweetener there. Sucralose can be used, will survive baking, but will also kind of provide a very intense sweetness from the beginning and lingering of the sweetness. So that's, in my opinion, it's not the right type of sweetness we get with the sucralose. And of course, we got none of these sugars will also contribute to the coloration of the crust.
So in addition to that answer, I would also look into a blend of sugar alcohols, which are also complementary to blends like stevia or asulfame K. I think that's the way you can compensate for the sweetness in your regular breads, because
Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
because
Sorry
I
to
think
interrupt.
most white pan breads and most whole wheat breads have more than 5% of sugar. And with that, we're going to see a huge difference if we just remove the sugar. So I think every baker out there should look into blends of sugar alcohols and blend them either with asulfame K or stevia.
Mhm. When you're talking about sugar alcohols, you thinking about glycerol or glycerine, or you're thinking about
I've heard,
maltitol,
yeah, I heard xylitol and erythritol,
xylitol?
yeah, being used. So those can be looked into.
Okay.
And there is a whole other realm of good for you kind of fixed sweeteners, and if you enter that realm, you'll realize that certain people don't like certain things. Like aspartame is just like the devil or something. I don't know what's wrong, but people don't like using it. I think the longer the artificial sweetener has been on the market, the more it has been vilified. So it's just
for aspartame, there have been some studies published with rats where it showed some carcinogenic effects. So
oh, okay.
yeah, so if you consider in Europe and Asia, they don't use aspartame. They only use stevia to sweeten their soft drinks and all that. So it's only in North America that we're using aspartame.
Well, I mean, so goes with saccharin, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's carcinogenic studies around there, but the whole world still uses it.
Yeah,
so it
an
really
old
depends on
generation.
which governing body that you really talk to, and whether that carcinogenic effect is valid, right? So I think a lot of it has to do with, again, we can go into a whole holistic discussion on artificial sweeteners. It depends on who you talk to and who is lobbying for it. So it's really tricky. Let's not go down that path for now.
Yeah, agree.
Okay, one thing that's a very interesting question. One thing I'm thinking of that could be done is to replace. Of course, I explained that the enzymes are modifying the starch, so you could only add a little bit more flour equal to the bulk of the high fructose corn syrup, or maybe water and flour. And that flour will become more substrate for the enzymes, and it will create the sugar from the starch and remain the bulk of the product, if you wish. So that would be one way to do that. Jacinthe, can you think of other ways to do that?
Adding fibers.
Adding fibers, yes.
Yeah, then it depends on the type of product you're wanting to create, for sure.
Yeah, and don't forget that sugars, like what Dr. Jacinthe said, is water binding, right? So it's not for the layman, it's like bulking, it's considered bulking, but really the sugar is binding to the water. That's why it's creating that bulk, right? So that's why using fibers would be a great idea, because fibers bind to water as well, right? So creating that bulk. So if you're looking for bulking, you're looking for, how sugar is such a huge part of your formula, just taking that away, it's just going to create a void in your formulation. Think about fibers and resistant fibers. think about hydrocolloids too. Sometimes that would help. And anything that's water binding, basically. Flour is a good water binder, but again, if you put too much flour in there, you're going to, mess things up. So use things that are pretty linear. Use things that only exalt water. So think about it that way in terms of bulking. Luke has the solution.
Yeah, that is exactly what we tried to show, or what Jacinthe tried to explain earlier. By using our cocktail of enzymes, you're gonna modify the starch in such a way that you're gonna produce fermentable sugars for the yeast and accomplish flow proof.
I say give that solution a try, and I believe we have Lallemand's contact on the chat window, right? Joanna, if not, could you put it there so that they could ask for a sample of that instead of using or dosing your own fermentable sugars? I think Lallemand has created a solution for you to just plug and play. Okay, I mean, you can always add your own fermentable sugars, and there are a lot of fermentable sugars that you could use.
Okay, the mechanism is, these are kind of a cocktail of the different starch modifying enzyme. So one of them is breaking down the starch in larger particle, dextrins, and from the damaged starch of the flour. And the other one is breaking these dextrins into smaller or 1 unit of glucose molecule. So it's kind of a synergy between two starch modifying enzyme that will produce, if you wish, the monosaccharides that the yeast can use to ferment.
Yeah, I think both texture and mold. I think it's obvious it's going to affect that. Your molding is going to be earlier because of the lack of lowering water activity effect from the sugars. So you might need to either ferment it longer to bring that pH down, or to increase your usage of CalPro or cultured wheat with probably an added acid, right? So you need to watch that molding because there's no more sugar in there to reduce the water activity. The second thing is what Dr. Jacinthe said on the sugar, the texture. And what have, Dr. Jacinthe, what have you done with the texture to, you take out sugar is a tenderizer. What did you put in its place?
Well, actually, I think it's a better question for Luke, but
what I was thinking, Lynn, when I was listening to you, I was thinking like there's also one issue that can happen during if you reduce sugar without replacing anything. The coloration is not coming as fast, and maybe people tend to bake more to get more coloration because very, very often we bake by visual observation, and they might be drying out the product, and then the texture is affected this way. You're right about also the mold growth, which would be accelerated with lower sugar levels in the bread. But there you can always use some crumb softening enzymes if you wish. There's a lot of them on the market. We do have some. to try to compensate for the difference in texture of the bread. Especially, I would think it should be a little bit less soft or a bit firmer, faster. So yeah, that would be my recommendation.
Right. Other things you could look at, I think, is increasing the tenderizing effect through using emulsifiers. If you're already using emulsifiers, things like monodiglycerides, things like just adding, 0.5% more oil into your formulation, and also, increase your staling enzymes levels to replace the effect of sugar on the texture shelf life. So these are the different things that you could do when you remove sugar.
While impacting the quality, meaning generating color difference or lack of sweetness or less sweetness, if that's what it's meant, I would say that the enzyme, we have a usage level, the range that we can use the enzymes, and the enzymes are working, depending on the pH, the enzyme concentration, the temperature, and everything. But in general, the enzyme concentration, it's a linear relation, and you can produce more sugar. So it means if you want, you can, in a normal proof time, you can produce a lot of sugar if you use enough enzyme, but there's always a cost of the enzymes associated with it. And but in general, I would say that you can decrease. In our examples earlier, we had in a normal proof time, we had production of the equivalent of 2% sugar during the normal proof time of the dough. So at a certain level of enzyme, so you could use more of the enzyme and generate even more sugar.
I also saw your graph. You went from 14% to 10%, didn't you, without seeing any kind of effect on
Yeah,
volume?
that is true. Even if you
Okay.
look more carefully at the loaves, you could have seen that even they were a bit more colored or slightly darker, so showing that, kind of indicating that there was a little bit more sugar than what the yeast has used to ferment.
Yeah, I think that's a possibility. Correct me if I'm wrong. To reduce a good 5% using your solution without seeing any kind of detrimental effect on the final bake quality.
I would agree very, very well with that statement.
Okay.
Yeah, 5% is probably a target that they were achievable. Usually the dough elasticity or the dough extensibility, to my understanding, is always related to the protein content of the flour, not to the starch, although I understand that the starch can change viscosity of the dough. If that's the question, then I would say that in our test, in the example we're given, and the test we ran, we haven't seen any dough rheology difference coming from the effect of the enzyme. Some of them, even at high level, you don't see any effect on the dough rheology.
So I do see some effect when we've done some studies to change out high fructose corn syrup to sugar. I do see some effect there in terms of plasticity. And that is the reason of the water, so I think you can compensate for the plasticity in that particular scenario with emulsifiers and hydrocolloids. if that matters to you. If that doesn't matter to you, then don't worry about it. You're just going to have a different rheology altogether with the dough. Just work with it and see whether the final product with this solution is what you want, right? So don't worry about the plasticity or the rheology of the dough. Just go ahead and bake it with the solution and see whether it's what you want. If it really affects your machining, if it affects your depositing and your cut rates, then you have to look into emulsifiers. Then you have to look into hydrocolloids. So that's my only contribution to that.
Yeah, to complete on Lin's explanation, I would say that in general, when we formulate, with high sugar levels in the dough, we, as a rule of thumb, we very often use for every 2% sugar we reduce, we could reduce 1% water. So that's rule of thumb we're using when we formulate.
Yeah, I think that's where we're going to see the effect on the rheology of the dough.
No added sugar. My understanding is yes, and the fact is if you don't add any sugar, it's in your formulation, you're not adding any sugar to the dough directly. So yeah, you're just generating the sugar with the enzyme. But I think in Canada there's a lot of different claims about in the US. I'm not sure exactly. Maybe Lin can help me on this one. But I don't know about exact legislation and what can be made as claim regarding added sugar. But in Canada,
it is whatever sugar is on your formulation, like you said.
Yes.
Yeah, if you don't add any sugar in, then that's no added sugar. It's whatever that you put in. It's not considering the fact what's in the flour already. Yeah. So if you have a sweeter flour, you start with a sweeter flour. Oh no, now we're gonna have innovations that way. Anyway, that is what added sugar means.
It's a bit, it comes back to a bit what we discussed earlier. If you reduce sugar, you will have to adjust water accordingly. Using emulsifiers, like Lin mentioned, it's a way to keep the crumb structure tight and fine. I know that using sugar usually give a finer crumb. But don't forget, the enzymes are also generating sugars in the dough, not exactly the same type of sugar like sucrose versus glucose, but there's many ways you can adjust the crumb structure by reducing sugar when you reduce sugar in your formulation.
Add less water, tighten up the crumb, and make it finer. That's my suggestion. Depends on your what you start with. I mean, if you start with a 2% sugar in your formulation, yeah, you can completely replace it. But if you're starting with 15 or 20% sugar in your formulation, you can't completely replace it.
We have an advice level. I think it's in between 1 ounce to 2 ounces per 100 pounds of flour, but that doesn't mean that we cannot use more. Usually we could use anywhere from 0.125% to 0.5%. The more you use, as I explained, the relation is a linear relation, and you get an increase proportional to the increase of the enzyme. So I would say that up to 0.5% you can use to increase the sugar production in the dough. it's on the label. The enzyme could be considered as a processing aid, and the ingredients is only flour and enzyme. So if you need to declare enzyme, then you only have to put enzyme on the label. Flour is already there, so you don't need to put that there.
Interesting.
My colleague Shamla shared in the chat box the email address if you want to request a sample. So you can see it in the chat box.
Well, I think we have come to the end of our Q&A, and I am very impressed with this particular innovation coming out from your lab. So congratulations. We really need the solution in the baking industry right now, especially with the keto trend and everybody watching the sugars. Those are really great data that you presented with the first 3 graphs, Dr. Jacinthe. So kudos to that. And if you have any more questions, please reach out to the email in the chat box. And I really appreciate both of you for coming on today. Thank you. And thank you everyone. Thank you everyone for coming on. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.